back to the Western Edge. Today's story that I'm going to be reading for you is another one from my anthology, What the Tide Brings In. It's called Broken and Left. It's basically about a man who is broken and left in the desert outside of Las Vegas. Reasons that I never really came up with, apart from he just wasn't useful to his bosses anymore. This is one of many stories that I've written over the years, and it's one that, believe it or not, just came upon me and was written in about 2 hours time. Probably needs some editing, probably needs a little work done to it, but otherwise it's one that I happen to enjoy when I wrote. It's a very short story this time, so it won't last that long, and I apologize for my really crappy accents when I start reading dialogue, but hopefully you'll get the point. So, let's get into it. Broken and Left, March 3rd, 2018, Las Vegas, Nevada. The sound of something crawling near his left ear woke him. Hard, chitinous claws, scratching and scraping on the dry and desiccated landscape sent spikes of fear racing down his spine, alighting on every nerve that was still left to function as he jumped up thanks to the sensation. Pain lit up his body like a malfunctioning circuit board, causing him to twist and bend in ways that only brought new aches and pains to mind as his body reminded him that he was still in one piece. That was good, in a way. Pain meant you were alive. It meant that the body wasn't quite ready to give up yet. But the amount of pain he felt in that moment almost made quitting seem feasible, even though he'd rather lick a car battery than give up. Giving in to the pain and the despair that had brought him to the state wasn't an option. It never had been. It wasn't in his nature, and he wasn't about to mend that now. But Lord, did it hurt. Even his hair seemed to ache as the throbbing in his skull came forth in waves, pulsing through every inch of his head and up to his hair follicles. It would have been a relief if that agony could have been transferred to the tips and dispersed, but it seemed to make its way up and then back down, down each individual strand to be redistributed into his skull again and again as it was fed back and forth. He wanted to shake his head at his current predicament, thinking that he'd finally gone and done something that would earn him the end his aunt had always spoken of. That would have meant another wave of torment. To hell with that. He wasn't wasting a moment on self-pity or causing himself any more harm. It was time to get up, move on, and find the bastards that had done this. They had a lesson they needed to relearn. You didn't stop the beating until your prey was good and dead. He could say this much. Those that had beaten him down and nearly killed him probably hadn't thought that he would wake up. His head was throbbing particularly hard near his right temple, where he could feel a slight indent as he probed with his fingers. Another spike of agony sank inward, though after his clumsy examination forced one fingertip to brush a little too hard against the spot, and his stomach heaved as the sensation was too much. It took everything he had just to roll over so he wouldn't choke on his own vomit, spewing what little was left inside as ribbons of gluey material came from his mouth. Wiping his parched and cracked lips with the back of his left hand caused him to wince as his skin felt like sandpaper, scraping and grating along his face as he still wiped the spittle from his chin. Spitting out the remainder behind his lips, it behooved him to look around, but once again he wasn't too surprised. He was in the middle of nowhere, it looked like, with parched and cracked badlands surrounding him for miles, along with acres of what seemed like acres of Joshua trees. There was a pile of rubble near him, leavings of a civilization that had seemingly just plopped a random pile of garbage amid some long-forgotten wasteland as a bad joke. But other than that, the nearest mountains looked to be too far off to even consider walking towards. There was no sign of a town or even a road in sight. His captors had wanted him to be difficult, if not impossible, to find. There was no doubt that there were predators around here, scavengers somewhere, but there was also the belief that his body would simply rot and deteriorate before anyone would ever find it, if enough was left after the scavengers were done. He couldn't see any tracks, no trail, and no one scurrying off in the distance. That made sense, though. There was no way they'd stick around to see if he was going to get back on his feet. And even if there was someone out there, he hoped they were watching. He even hoped they'd send word to those that had done this to him. The devil they knew wasn't dead yet, but he was determined to get his due. March 4th, 2018. He spent his first night in the wild in the open, trying to keep his eyes open as much as possible. It was entirely likely that he had a concussion, but it was also a big possibility that there were predators out there who were just waiting for him to seem too weak to fight them off. Despite his beaten and battered state, though, he'd seen and heard nothing save for the wind as it had blown across the hardscrabble, chilling him to the bone as he'd shuddered uncontrollably, unable to find anything to warm himself with. Instead, he'd opted to stick his hands deep in his armpits and just hope to survive the night. There was no fear within him at this point, especially since rage was driving him onward. It was a fire in his gut that almost eclipsed the pain he was in, though not by much. When the sun had crested the horizon behind him, the coming warmth had been more welcome than anything he'd received in the past several years. It felt like the light touch of a lover, seeking to rouse him while at the same time congratulating that he'd stayed alive. Were he the type to cry out in joy at the prospect, he might have done so, but all he could think of now was sinking his thumbs into the eyes of the man who had worded this fate that had been foisted upon him. He wasn't a good man, that was certain, but he was still allowed to be vengeful when he'd been wronged. Of that much he was even more certain. In his life, he'd ruined many a person, taken lives when he'd been ordered to do so, and brought people to those that had been condemned to die or suffer for the rest of their natural-born lives. But he'd done his job, and he'd done it well. The one job that had finally been his end, or so his former employer had hoped, had been the one he'd wanted to do the least. There was no room in bounty hunting for those with a big heart, no matter what the movies, books, or TV shows said. If you had a heart, it made you careless, sloppy, and it eventually got you killed. There were simply too many greenhorns out there trying to make a name for themselves by taking on the tough jobs that no one wanted. They had no problem dusting an older, more experienced bastard like him just to get what they wanted. The only problem with that was the fact that some of the old dogs didn't appreciate being stepped over, or anyone thinking that they could do so with impunity. It had been one job that screwed him. Just one. But that was usually how it went in this business. March 5th, 2018. By the end of the second day, he'd reached the end of the parched and heat-baked landscape, but his steps were shuffling and unsteady as he made his way towards what he hoped wasn't a mirage. In the near distance, he could see what looked like a beaten-down old building that was somehow still serviceable despite the decrepit look it presented. Bright neon lettering that might have flickered and barely illuminated the sign was attached to, announced as the Waste Stop Diner, a clever name for another era that fell woefully flat in this day and age. The dark ribbon of asphalt that separated it from the dusty parking area of the diner was thankfully empty for what looked like miles and miles in each direction. The sand-dusted front windows of the place were currently blocked by blinds that were no doubt to keep the sun from pouring in to disturb the diners. Looking at the parking lot, he could guess that this place didn't get all that crowded during the daytime. Mustering up the nerve to move forward after giving another cautious look to the left and then the right, he crossed the two-lane throughway and made his way to the diner. As he came closer and closer, he could feel his throat clenching and his mouth begin to water from the smells that were emanating from within. Despite not having any customers, the proprietor was still bound and determined to keep things ready. He wanted to go in right now and order as much as his stomach would hold, but he had something that he needed to be done first. It would only take a second. He'd waited for a couple of days now to eat and drink. He could wait a few seconds more. He was on his third plate when the young woman that had been serving him, pretty enough to be a model perhaps, decided to interrupt his meal. He just shook his head, knowing very well from the look in her eyes and the hand resting on her left hip that she was about to ask him something else. Instead of replying, he just wiped at his mouth with his napkin, figuring that he'd worn out his welcome a full meal ago. The meatloaf had been good, the chicken wasn't too bad, but whoever was doing the cooking knew how to cook a steak like no one else. It had been done medium rare just as he'd asked, and not burned to a crisp like some other joints he'd been to. "Are you ready for the check, Dan?" "Nope," he said, shaking his head as he wadded up his napkin. "I'll be going now." He was on his feet and heading towards the door before her shock wore off. The look of indignation he'd seen dissolving into something akin to desperation as she looked as though she wanted to follow him. Instead, she called back to the kitchen for a guy named Sal, yelling at the top of her voice that he hadn't paid for his food and then he was on his way out the door. "Hey, you old buzzard!" The bellow was about as deep as he expected. Turning around, he wasn't too disappointed to see a tall, burly man with a slight gut storming towards him. Face reddened, no doubt, from working over a hot grill and from being incensed about his only customer's sense of entitlement. "Walk away," he said as the big man, Sal, hefted something in his right hand. Thankfully, it wasn't a knife, but it was something that could do some serious damage if he let this happen. Sal didn't seem to hear him, though, grunting as he swung the meat tenderizer at him in a low arc that was no doubt meant to take him in the stomach. Maybe Sal wasn't used to fighting anyone that could fight back. Oh well, life was full of surprises. Taking the mallet away from Sal was easy enough, but checking his swing to make sure he didn't kill the man was harder. He wasn't used to showing mercy thanks to the nature of his job, but in this instance, he was in the wrong, and he could admit it. But that didn't mean he was going to let the bigger man brutalize him. Instead of bashing Sal on the head with the first strike, he slammed the mallet hard into the man's right hand, which was even now reaching for his weapon. He used the flat side to smash the man's palm. The smack of metal on flashed loud in the empty restaurant. Sal's grunt of pain wasn't satisfying in the least, but again, he didn't want to maim or seriously wound. He just wanted to get his point across. "Back off, Sal," he said quietly. "I don't want any beef with you." "Too bad," Sal growled as he shook his injured hand. "'Cause you... Ugh!" Shaking his head, he slammed the mallet just hard enough between Sal's eyes to make them cross for a moment before he tumbled backward, hitting the fatal linoleum floor hard as his outstretched arms each struck a table on their respective sides. "I'm calling the cops," the young woman said. "Okay," he replied, letting the mallet slip from his hand to the floor. If she had a cell phone on her, then it might be that the cops would arrive a few minutes later than he expected, but as he heard the unmistakable dial tone of a handheld phone, he noticed something shiny sticking out of one of Sal's pockets. Leaning down, he jerked on the keychain he found sticking out, pulling free a bundle of keys in the process. Looking up, he could see the girl staring at him from the opening to the kitchen, a knife in her free hand as she stared at him in abject terror. "Calm down," he said to her. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I don't even want to hurt him. If he wants his rig back, he can come find it in the parking structure of the Bellagio. I'm assuming that I'm only an hour or less out of Vegas. Yes?" She nodded, seeming dumbstruck. So he'd been correct in the assumptions he'd been holding on to. The bastards hadn't even been smart enough to drop him somewhere he couldn't easily walk out of. Sighing to himself, he stood up, giving the woman one more look before he walked to the front door. It was time to go settle up. Thankfully, Sal had a full tank of gas and kept his truck, an old Chevy, perhaps a 77 or a few years later, in good shape. He'd added a few things and perhaps even upgraded here and there, but otherwise it felt authentic. Turning on the radio, he switched over to an oldies rock station, enjoying the tunes as he kept the window down and his mind on his final goal. He knew where to find the men that had beaten him. He knew where they would likely be, and he knew very well if they had any sense they expected him to be making his way back. They were stupid enough to leave him alive but beaten, but he had a hunch that their boss wanted a final go at him before punching his ticket for the final time. That was fine. He had one stop to make before he got to the Strip, and then he'd be making his final house call before leaving the state. Inhaling through his nose, he had to grimace as the bruised ribs he'd incurred ached from the effort, reminding him that it had only been a couple of days since his beatdown. That was okay. The pain that should have left him all but crippled was keeping him going, keeping him sharp. That was the adrenaline rush, too, and it would wear off eventually. But before it did, he meant to at least get to the one hidey-hole boring good old Las Vegas before he passed out for the night. If he had a concussion, then he should be in the clear by now, he hoped. Last night had gone fine, and he woke easily enough. The other injuries he'd incurred were likely worse. A mashed-up left hand that didn't matter as much, a couple of fingers broken on his right hand that could be splinted, and his ribs, of course. Thankfully, there was nothing else but cuts, abrasions, a couple of gashes, and a lot of deep bruising that would heal on its own eventually. It took about as long as he'd figured, close to an hour, before he reached the outskirts of Vegas, and it took another 20 minutes to get to his cache, as it was in a storage bin, located in a storage bin at a point between Vegas and Henderson. Keying in his code to get into the gated storage area, he drove Sal's truck right up to his unit, a spacious, apartment-sized storage locker he'd been renting for the past few years. Shutting off the engine, he made his way over to the lock, thumbing the hidden catch that was his backup in case he ever lost his key. It took one good yank to send the door rattling upwards and along its track, exposing the well-ordered mayhem that was ready and waiting. "Home sweet home," he muttered, grinning to himself as he stepped into the garage locker. It wouldn't matter if he waited until nightfall, as Vegas was a city that didn't sleep, much like New York. But unlike the Big Apple, America's playground didn't always keep a close eye on the clock. For all the people in the casinos knew, the sun could rise and fall a dozen times so long as they were kept buzzed enough to keep plunking their quarters and the deeds of their home. Yielded enough spending money to lace the tables for a while. He'd seen people burn through fortunes at the tables while walking the floors, and had always shaken his head to think how many suckers came to Vegas with the belief that they'd spend just a little and then catch a show with a meal later. Most of them were lucky if they had enough for one of the shitty buffets down the street when they were done. Going down Frank Sinatra Drive was the best way to get back, and with the outfit he changed into from his stash, which was updated as much as it could be, he'd be indistinguishable from any of the staff. The key card he'd had made for him by one of his people on the inside was hopefully still good, but he knew other ways in if it wasn't. They'd see him coming if he walked through the casino, which is why he was going in the back, which was likely what they expected as well. At least going in through the back wouldn't set off any metal detectors that could derail him before he reached his destination. If he was correct in his thinking, the mugs that had left him for dead would think that the job was done and over with, while the one that had overseen them would likely be waiting for him. The Brit, which was what everyone called him because he was a British hitman, or ex-hitman as he liked to say, was the only guy between him and the boss that had been the only man that could have ordered this hit. Once he got through the Brit, assuming he was still standing, the boss would be next. Then it would be a full-on run toward freedom. He almost felt bad that he wouldn't be returning Sal's truck like he said, but he needed a mode of transport. He'd see if he could get as far as Reno and then see about switching up. But for now, the truck had been sufficient to haul the load of supplies he'd taken with him from his storage unit. He'd just about cleaned the unit out, leaving only a few hangers and outfits that were going to be no good to him soon. After he was done, if he were standing, he would have to run. He didn't mind that part. Only a fool stuck around once his luck had run out. But he believed in spreading the luck when it came around. As he pulled into the back parking lot of the Bellagio Hotel, a place that was like a small city unto itself, he breathed deeply through his nostrils as he checked his personal inventory, making sure he had enough weaponry on him to take down a small army if need be. Everything was small enough to be concealed and was easily accessible. It was time to go spread the luck. Finding the three goons that had been hired to beat him senseless was easy. They were in one of the little-known back rooms playing cards along with a few of their buddies. Obviously, the belief that he would be coming back wasn't a heavy burden on their minds, since not one of them had their weapons readied, and a couple of them didn't even have their guns nearby. Killing them all with hesitation almost felt too easy, but he hadn't paused as he walked right by them, beating down a door that lay behind the mercy killings he'd just committed to find one of the men he'd been looking for, seated at a large wooden desk, smoking a cigar, and looking for all the world like he knew this was bound to happen. "Kinda thought you'd be here earlier," Red said, a grin on his face as cigar smoke wafted from between his teeth. He was called the Brit because he was in fact from the UK, but also because very few knew his actual name. He was a bruiser of a man with a bald head and rough-looking features, but out of all the people the Brit had done business with, he was the one bounty hunter the big man had never tried to mess with, until now. "You got to understand it was just orders now," Britt said, seeming not a bit worried that there was a man that fully intended to kill him standing in the doorway. "You'd have done the same if they tapped you for the job." He shook his head. "I wouldn't have done the same. I would have finished it." The Brit laughed as he reached for a glass that was half filled with an amber liquid that he swirled around a bit. "Let us finish, yeah? McDowell, we said the hell has a place for those what don't finish good scotch." "That the reserve?" The Brit grinned as he closed his eyes. "Oh yeah, nothing but the best." He merely nodded, letting the other man swig the drink in one long swallow as he winced, holding the glass up for a moment before swallowing. The two of them had knocked a few drinks back together in the past, and he knew very well that the Brit was right. It was just business. But he took getting assaulted rather personal all at the same time. Ugh. As the other man put his glass down, he didn't look the hunter in the eye. But he did work up the nerve to speak. "It's what fucked up day you and two mates gotta square off, eh?" He didn't answer, knowing very well that the other man usually had a weapon on him, even if it couldn't be seen. "Right," Britt said with a sigh. "Come on, then." If someone had been there to witness the exchange, they might not have been able to track their movements at that moment. The Brit was fast, but he was just a hair faster as he raised his dual pistols and took aim in the same breath, squeezing off 2 rounds and then, lowering the firearms just an inch or so, firing off 2 more. The Brit rocked back in his chair as the shoulders of the jacket he was wearing tore suddenly. Their fabric flayed open as red flew to strike the wall behind him. Only a second later, both arms were hanging loosely at his side, completely useless as 2 more red patches had appeared in the middle of each arm. The first shots had taken the Brit in the shoulders, no doubt creating massive exit wounds that had damaged both shoulder blades, while the other 2 had been hit with a bit of luck and a lot of practice, obliterating his elbow joints as his arms had become little more than unresponsive lumps of flesh at his sides. And despite all that, after the initial shock wore off, the Brit found it within him to laugh. It was a coarse, barking sound that came from his lips, but it was still there as he rocked forward, looking up at the hunter as he walked toward him. "I had to try," he said, working through the pain as his eyes narrowed with each word. "Couldn't just let you set me off." "I know," the hunter replied. "Do us a favor then," Britt breathed. "End it. I think I've been nice enough to deserve it." Some men might have hesitated in that moment. Some might have argued. He simply put one of his pistols to the top of the Brit's head and pulled the trigger. It was more than he deserved, but it was something anyway. From another doorway behind where the Brit had been sitting, you could hear the furtive sounds of someone trying to be quiet, and failing horribly. Time for the headman, then. Later on, Reno, Nevada, March 7th, 2019. He'd stayed as true to his word as he could. Sal's truck had been left in the Bellagio parking lot not long after he procured another vehicle that would suit his needs. With the added cash he liberated from his former boss's safe, after divesting the man of his dignity and his life, he purchased a rather cozy SUV from a nearby lot that had just the right amount of storage space for his gear. No one had tried to stop him on his way out, as no one was really allowed back in the areas that he and a few others had even known about. The car salesman had been too happy to simply hand the keys over when he'd paid in cash, though he had no doubt that such a transaction had made the man nervous. That was why he disabled the transceiver he knew was bound to be installed somewhere on the vehicle a few miles down the road from the city limits. Being a bounty hunter meant he had to know how. Being a bounty hunter meant he'd known a few things and had developed a few skills along the way that he made good use of on a daily basis. Excuse me. Disabling a tracker was commonplace to him these days. After that, he tossed the transceiver as fast and as hard into the desert as he could, hoping that the signal would stay long enough for the cops to go on a wild goose chase. He'd figured that by the time he hit Reno, it would be best to find an auto shop and see about getting a paint job. As of now, he was sitting comfortably in one of the many low-key pubs the city had to offer, enjoying a cold brew even as his body continued to remind him that that long ago day about a year ago when he'd taken such a horrific beating. He'd stopped pissing blood after a few days, so that was something, but the damage he incurred would remain with him for a while. It had been just a matter of finding the right doctor that wouldn't feel the need to ask too many questions to get himself fixed up. But the chances of getting away that day had been astronomical, at least at that time. But then again, living away from the edge had never been his style. My apologies for some of the pauses there. But that was Broken and Left. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you will tune in for more stories as they keep coming, and as I go along, I will keep trying to get the hang of movie reactions, so hopefully I'll give you something more to watch. This is Tom from the Western Edge. Be good.